What's up, folks? This is Ryan from Clever Beagle, and I want to use this video as an opportunity to kick off a new series here on the channel. So, for about, it's probably been about a year now, maybe a little less than that, I've been doing these Feature Friday tutorials. So if you haven't already checked those out, definitely check out the playlist down below or back on the channel. There's all kinds of videos of me kind of walking you through how I build features and how I think about writing features and just kind of explaining general techniques about writing code to actually produce a tangible result in your application. And that's worked okay. And I hope that some of you have learned some stuff from that. But I felt like a few months, and I felt like this for a while, but I wanted to make sure it wasn't just me being fussy. I wanted to make sure it was actually a reasonable thing to think, which is this. I realized that the reason I started Clever Beagle was for someone who was like me back around, I think it was like 2012. So back around that time, I had very little JavaScript experience. I mean, we're talking, I didn't even know what an argument was in a function. I would read somebody's article or tutorial and they'd be talking about like, oh, you know, pass this as the second argument. And I would just kind of like scratch my head like, what is an argument? And very, very recently, I've been getting, I guess you could call it nostalgic about that time period. I was thinking like, I was so excited by just ideas and possibilities and how could I take whatever was in my head and actually put it on a screen. And I knew how to do that from the perspective of like the HTML and CSS. I could design an interface and I could get it in the browser, but I couldn't make it work. And so it was around 2013, I kind of got lucky. And this framework came out called Meteor. And Meteor was one of those turning points in terms of how I personally understood code or thought about building things. And what was unique about Meteor was it was the first time I was able to apply skills that I had already, meaning JavaScript from the browser, to also execute code on a server. And at the time, Node.js was around, but the information that was out about it was really confusing. And again, this was far beyond my understanding of JavaScript. But Meteor was one of those first things that like brought together all of the ideas and just made sense to me. And the documentation was great, and the community was starting to build up, and there was just a lot of excitement around it. And it was very easy to find my way. And so I got kind of lucky. I was in this position where I was able to follow a path and really develop my skill set in a relatively short amount of time. We're talking maybe seriously working with Meteor now, probably about 6 years on the long side of it, but you know, not that long. And more recently, and you know, as Meteor's kind of dipped off in terms of prominence and popularity, myself and other developers have gone out and about into the broader JavaScript ecosystem and have tried to find like, well, what are some other tools that are options that kind of match the strength of something like Meteor? And I've been asking that question for about 2 years now. I've been trying to figure out like, well, what is the thing that gives me this cohesive set of tools in a way that's going to work extremely well, but doesn't necessarily have we'll call it the gravity of a framework. So, you know, like a framework comes out and it gets hyped and then inevitably like some people stick with it, some people don't. And it's just kind of this roller coaster of sorts that usually plays out over a few years. And I've taken a look at some of the more recent tooling that exists. So I know a popular one is something like Gatsby. A lot of people seem to like that. Next.js is another one. That's another popular one. And all these tools exist, and all these tools are great in their own way, but they lack that quality that I've been after. And the more I thought about that quality, the more I realized, like, well, even though Meteor, at the time you came across it, was that cohesive thing, I still had to figure out all of these little bits and bobs. I still didn't really understand, like, well, what is a function? What is function scope? What are the different types of variables that I can use? How do I piece all this together? And so writing tutorials on the site that I used to run called the Meteor Chef, that was the way that I put it together. It was literally through sitting down and just having to figure it out that I actually learned how to write JavaScript. But I realized like that's not really practical for everybody. And yes, there are tutorials that exist on the web about JavaScript. There's thousands, if not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. I don't want to know how many. But the thing that, and I've really kept an eye out for this over the years, the one thing that I didn't see was practical information. Meaning there's a heavy emphasis on the language and the code and the libraries and the packages, but not really taking those things and putting them together. And that was my focus at the Meteor Chef, and I kind of put that down honestly because it burned me out. Like I was writing these 10,000 word tutorials. At one point I think I was putting out like 4 tutorials a week. It was obsessive. And that slowly tapered off, but I was still doing like one of those a week, it was pretty aggressive. And, you know, I tapered off from that, but now I'm kind of thinking like, there's a void here. This needs to be filled. There's something missing where you've got all of these different parts and everybody's got their own opinion about how to build things, and it can be overwhelming. And I think like, okay, if it's overwhelming for me as somebody who has several years of experience with this, what is it like for somebody just starting out? And I don't just ask that from the perspective of building a skill set over time, but also when you're in that position where you have an idea that you want to create, there's really nothing more frustrating than not being able to produce it in some way. Meaning, even like a rudimentary version of it, whether that's like doing a mock-up in a design program, or in this case, writing some fundamental code to get it to work. There's nothing really more frustrating than that. And the more I look around, the more I see all this emphasis on the technology itself and not what can we do with the technology. So that's a long way of saying or introducing you to what I'm going to start calling feature fundamentals. So, and this is probably going to drive some of you nuts. So if you've been following me for a while, or you've been watching the Feature Friday videos that I've been doing, this is probably going to drive you crazy. And the reason why is that when I say feature fundamentals, I mean fundamentals. So what I want to do is go back to the basics. I want to go back to the fundamentals of JavaScript. I want to talk about how does JavaScript work? What is JavaScript? And I also want to talk about what are variables, what are functions, and all of those things. But I want to do it in the context of practical examples. So where I used to do really long form tutorials that were practical implementations of things like how to build a chat application with Meteor, I want to do the same thing, but I want to do it on an ever smaller scale, or at least I want to try. Because I think that it's relatively easy to pick up a language like JavaScript once you have a very clear context to think within. And now I'm going to start with the basics and fundamentals of JavaScript, but I want to slowly ratchet that up. And I also want to take a slow approach to this. So as we all know, the world's chaotic, it's crazy, there's tons of new stuff all the time just flying at you. But I want to kind of take a different approach here. I want to say, okay, what if we slow it down a little bit and we just say like, okay, what is this thing? What is this thing? And do it in a sequence where somebody who was in the position I was back in 2012, so that person is in that position today, can comfortably in 6 months, maybe a year, maybe a little bit more than that, feel relatively confident with these technologies and actually be able to produce something. So that's the goal. And I'm eventually, yes, going to build back up to, at least this is the idea right now. We'll see, plans never really tend to work out, but this is the goal, is to build back up toward full-blown applications. And we'll talk more about that down the road. But for now, I just want to get back to fundamentals. I want to get back to the basics, and I want to talk about like, okay, beyond all of the frameworks, beyond all of the tools, what is the thing underlying all of those tools that we're building with? And I think it's going to help a lot of people figure out and realize that tools are just abstractions built on top of the language. They're not it. So what I mean by that is I hear people all the time, especially when I'm mentoring them, I'll hear stuff like, well, I'm gonna write this in React code. And it takes me back a second. I have to say, like, wait a minute, what do you mean React code? And I realize, like, and this isn't the fault of those programmers. This is just kind of the nature of the beast, is that they don't realize that, oh, React and Angular and Vue and all these other things are independent of JavaScript. And I've seen it enough times where it's alarming. And I want to say, okay, even if it drives some of you folks nuts, you know, like send me hate mail, whatever. But I want to try this. I want to see. Maybe this will be a total flop. Maybe nobody will watch these, and I'll just you know, come with my this is Clever Beagle, so I'll come back to you with my tail between my legs in a few months and be like, well, I'm sorry. Or maybe this will be something that helps a lot of people out and gets them on the path to actually being able to execute on their ideas. So that's the plan, and that's what the goal is for Feature Fundamentals. So we're going to start with the very basics of JavaScript, and I want to clarify that. So the thing that I specialize in is JavaScript, and I think JavaScript is a great language for people who are new to programming or are just beginners and are more interested in, you know, the execution side of things. So you want to build things, you want to make things, more so than you're worried about code optimization. And I think that's a good place to start. So this first video is just an introduction. Starting next week, I'm gonna kick things off with a brief discussion about what is JavaScript and just talk about at a high level what it is we're gonna be getting into. And then from there on, it's just gonna be me kind of riffing on, like, here's what this thing is and here's what it might look like applied in a practical context. So that's what we're gonna try out here. Again, if that sounds like a horrible idea, or if you're just like, no, I don't want to watch that, somebody's already done that, whatever. So we'll just put it under the umbrella of hate mail. Go ahead and send it to me. I do want to know. I want your feedback. But I think this is a worthy thing to try out, or worthwhile thing to try out. So we're gonna see how it goes. So that's it for this week. But I will be back next week with our first feature fundamental video on what is JavaScript.